Hi there, and welcome to the spring webinar series, Resources for Cannabis Businesses. My name is Dale Sky Jones, and I am the Executive Chancellor of Oaksterdam University, the first and longest running cannabis college in the world. I am excited to be your moderator this evening for tonight's topic, cannabis production and alternative opportunities. We are here tonight because the Department of Cannabis Regulation has officially launched the Business Licensing and Compliance Assistance, or BLC, program to assist social equity applicants in the city of Los Angeles with obtaining a commercial cannabis license and operating a successful cannabis business. This series is part of a broader BLC program effort, which also includes live webinars with different subject matters and experts such as tonight, checklists, worksheets, and other management tools that you can download and use, as well as self-directed online education on important topics related to running a successful cannabis business through the BLC's new learning management system, usually referred to as an LMS. And this is for you. So please visit cannabis.lacity.org for more announcements on our ever-expanding BLC program. As part of the city's social equity program, DCR has launched the BLC Assistance Program LMS portal, where you now have access to these recorded webinars, in addition to the online courses and digital resources made especially for you. Information on how to access this LMS will be in the chat as we go along. And please note, there is a much longer educational series on tonight's topic already available live in this LMS. So please go check out the full series, Cannabis Production and Alternative Pathways, if you've not already done so. Before we get started on tonight's topic, we have a few housekeeping rules. So please note, this webinar is being recorded and it can be viewed after the editing process via a few different channels, so stay tuned. You will be muted with cameras off for the duration of this webinar, and that means that your camera and audio functions will not be available to you during this session. However, you will be able to see and hear the panelists and myself. There is an open chat box where you can interact with one another for networking or comment on the information at hand. And please do ask questions about this subject matter in the Q&A box. We are gathering these questions and we'll be responding to as many of your questions as possible during the Q&A session towards the last 20 minutes of this 1-hour webinar. You are really encouraged to use this Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So go ahead and check out where it is right now. That chat is available for interaction with other participants. But if you use that Q&A box for the questions, if we answer it by typing it out, everyone will see, and otherwise they'll just be collected towards the end for everyone to hear the answers. Please make sure, this is really important, pull up your calendar real quick and save the date for March 19th. RSVP to get more information because DCR is holding a live Grow 22 career fair. So this is for job seekers and for employers. So make sure you show up. We'll drop a link in the chat for that as well. Also, friendly reminder, please make sure you use caution when sharing your personal information. This is a public forum. Keep your questions focused on tonight's topic. It's going to move very fast. And without further ado, it is my esteemed pleasure to introduce you to tonight's subject matter expert, Natalie Darvis. As a certified master gardener with more than 15 years of experience in outdoor cannabis cultivation, Natalie continues to disseminate her knowledge and philosophy of sustainable, closed-looped, beyond organic horticultural models and best practices as the chair of our business department of Oaksterdam University. Natalie Darvis is also the founder and managing partner of Cougar Acres Consulting, a seed to sale strategy and content firm. In 2011, Natalie founded Cougar Acres Consulting to further outdoor cultivation pursuits and hands-on research. After attaining her executive MBA from Sonoma State University with an emphasis in the wine business, Ms. Darvis now focuses the firm on extensive corporate and small business projects in the cannabis industry. To date, Natalie has assisted over 60 plus cannabis companies with developing strategies to compete in the burgeoning cannabis market. And Natalie currently serves on the Cannabis Policy Oversight Team for the City of Portland's Department of Civic and Community Life. She's also very excited to be your subject matter expert this evening. Hi, Natalie. Welcome.
Hi, Dale. Thank you so much for
Take
that
it away.
wonderful welcome. I'm so excited to be here. Let's go ahead and get started with the material for this evening. So, tonight we are talking about cannabis production and alternative opportunities, which is kind of an interesting title. And what we're really going to be diving into this evening is looking at all these different opportunities that we have across the cannabis supply chain. And we're not going to focus especially on retail because we've had an amazing set of series and resources presented on retail opportunities in cannabis. We are going to talk about retail, but we're really going to look at what are the different avenues you could pursue as both an entrepreneur and a new business owner, as well as someone who's looking to transition their career into the cannabis workspace, and what are the different opportunities we have across the supply chain. So in tonight's webinar, we're going to talk about really what is the cannabis supply chain. We're going to define that. We're going to talk about what a supply chain is. We're also going to look at, what is cultivation? What are the different other types of licenses you can have besides retail in the cannabis space? And we're really also going to delve into what are the partnership opportunities. So what are the ways that all of us in the cannabis community can work together to support one another in our businesses and in our workforce development? And we're also going to leave a nice healthy amount of time to have a great Q&A session, so I can answer whatever's coming up for all of you as I'm giving you all this amazing information. So let's go ahead and dive in, and we're going to start with what is the cannabis supply chain. So all commodities, meaning anything that you buy, has a supply chain. And a supply chain is the ecosystem of firms that's involved in bringing cannabis products to market, from cultivation to sellable goods. So most of the time when we walk into a store and we buy something, we might not think about the million tiny steps it took to actually get the item we're buying, to the point where us as the end consumer is able to purchase it. And so these supply chains actually define economics. They define, how we actually grow or produce or manufacture items. And the cannabis supply chain is especially unique. One of the main reasons why it's so unique is that it's one of the most highly regulated supply chains on planet Earth. With the exception of maybe pharmaceuticals in the United States, cannabis is one of the most regulated supply chains. There's also a really interesting nuance to the cannabis supply chain because it started off as a commodity, right? Cannabis was a commodity that was unregulated or deregulated. And now we're bringing this whole new sphere of regulation, and there's all these very specific business considerations within that supply chain. So beyond just what we might normally think of in the cannabis supply chain, which might be the cultivators who grow the cannabis, the manufacturers who extract the cannabis, the distributors who receive the goods that we are either manufacturing or growing and get it tested and delivered to the retailers, there's also a ton of other folks in the supply chain to get cannabis to the end consumer. And most of these other businesses are either considered plant touching or non-plant touching. A plant touching business is one that actually has to have a license in order to handle cannabis products, but there's a whole other side to the supply chain where people don't actually need a license to operate within the cannabis supply chain, but they're servicing the folks who do have a license. What might that be? A good example of that would be a CPA who focuses on helping cannabis businesses file their tax returns. There could also be lawyers who are focusing on the cannabis space. There's educational institutions that provide cannabis focused information. So these non-plant touching or ancillary businesses are a huge part of this supply chain. And so when we think about this word chain, it's because it's a bunch of links that have to work together in order to have the final product reach us as a consumer. So as you walk into a dispensary or retail location next time, maybe stop and think about, wow, it really did take a lot of different steps straight from when a cultivator started growing this cannabis to actually for me to receive this product, purchase this product in this retail location. So now that we understand the supply chain, let's also take a moment and think about cultivation. Cultivation is the cornerstone of the supply chain. This means that without cannabis cultivators, we actually wouldn't even have an industry. And why is that? Well, we cultivate cannabis for their prized compounds, meaning terpenes and cannabinoids. And without cultivators actually growing this cannabis flower, which is defined as biomass, if we're talking about growing cannabis at a big scale, we wouldn't have any of these end consumer products. So even if you're purchasing a topical salve that has cannabinoids in it, It started off way back in the supply chain as cannabis flowers, a cannabis plant that was grown, and then we extracted out the cannabinoids that we then merged with our topical solution. So without cultivation, we wouldn't have the entire rest of the supply chain of the industry. And so cultivation really is the foundation. As you heard in my intro, I started off as a cultivator in the cannabis space. I love the cultivation segment of the cannabis industry. And I think it's really important that we understand the unique role that cultivators have within the supply chain link system. We start there. So without cultivation, there would be no cannabis industry. And it's really important, regardless of where you are, if you're a retailer, if you're a manufacturer, if you're a bud tender, if you're a distributor, you're working in a distribution company, you really need to understand the role of cultivation and respect and think about, what can I do to support my cultivators? And I think in Los Angeles, it's especially important concept, because we don't actually have a lot of zones that are allowed for cultivation. And so a lot of the cannabis biomass that we're moving around within Los Angeles was actually cultivated in other parts of the state. But there's definitely opportunities to grow cannabis within LA. And that's something that all of you should consider. So what is the outlook for getting involved in the cultivation side of the cannabis supply chain? So either you're considering going for a cannabis business license to cultivate cannabis, or you're considering working in a cannabis cultivation operation. Well, fortunately, demand for flower within the state of California remains strong. So what do I mean by that? When we're analyzing the data on what is actually being sold at cannabis retail outlets or dispensaries, we see that about 45 to 65% of the total products that are moving out the door out of dispensaries is still just cannabis flower. Obviously, there's so many other products that are available, and we do see a massive rise in demand for concentrated cannabis products. But flower, or cannabis biomass, it's actually just smoked or consumed in that way, is still 45 to 65% of the total sales. And then in addition to that, pre-rolls, which is ground up cannabis flower that is already manufactured into a joint that people can purchase and smoke, that's about 5 to 10% of total sales. So if you combine this together, being involved in the cannabis industry at the cultivation level is really smart, because you always have a job, right? Because we have no industry without cultivation. So there are a lot of different ways that you can look at cultivating cannabis. There are many, there's many different modalities, meaning you grow it indoors, you grow it outdoors, you grow it in a greenhouse. But beyond that, there's also a lot of jobs within cannabis cultivation facilities, which are really fun and interesting jobs, especially if you like to work with your hands, if you find growing plants interesting, science, there's lots of opportunities within there. So if you're interested in starting a cultivation operation, you definitely want to look at, what facilities are available for you to work at or to lease in order to start a cultivation facility. And there's so much more that we could talk about tonight around cannabis cultivation. But as Dale mentioned in our intro, we have this amazing, really robust series that extends from this webinar in your learning management system. And there's a lot more info in there about cannabis cultivation. And I highly encourage everybody to check that out. So the outlook for cultivation is good in the sense that we absolutely have to have cannabis cultivators. But I do want to take a moment and pause and think about the fact that California has always been the leader in cannabis cultivation across the United States, right? The sort of history, culture around cannabis cultivation, it really originated in California. So we do have a lot of pre-existing operators within the cultivation side of the cannabis supply chain. So that means there is a lot of competition. And that's something that all of you would want to consider if you are considering pursuing a cannabis cultivation license. But that also means that there's a lot of job opportunities as well. So definitely consider both sides. The next sort of alternative opportunity. So what do I mean by this? Again, tonight we're sort of delving into what are all the different ways that we can get involved in the cannabis sector. And one of them is also industrial hemp. So let's pause for a moment and make sure we all understand what industrial hemp is. So the Farm Bill in 2018 created a pathway for cannabis plants to be grown legally at the federal level. It was pretty mind-blowing when this happened. And what the federal government said is that as long as these cannabis plants express with less than 0.3% THC when they're harvested, that they are now industrial hemp. And it's created a whole new economy and a whole new market. So industrial hemp is not just the flowers that are grown from hemp, it's actually also cannabis seed and stalk and fiber. And there's so many practical applications of growing hemp. So in terms of cannabis seed, this is actually a wonderful ingredient for animal feed. In terms of stalk and fiber, this can create remarkable textiles and building materials. All of these are sectors where you could get involved, either again, working in this industry or starting a hemp company that also doesn't require this really complex licensing process that we currently have in place for high THC cannabis. So when I say high THC cannabis, you will always remember that I'm talking about all cannabis that's grown that's outside of this designation of hemp, which again has to have less than 0.3% THC in it. Another big part of the industrial hemp sector right now is the farming of these plants for non-THC cannabinoids. So that means CBD, CBG, CBN, and there's actually over 158 cannabinoids that can express in the cannabis plant. So we're going to start seeing even more cannabinoids enter into the market. Right now, about 90% of all hemp production in the United States is focused on farming these plants for non-THC cannabinoids. But we're missing out on all these amazing opportunities to grow hemp for seed and stalk and fiber. So I hope all of you consider that as well. So now let's move to manufacturing. So manufacturing is any process where we're converting something to something else. And that's a really general term. But in cannabis, when we talk about manufacturing, we really mean that we're taking the cannabis biomass, flower that we grew, and we're oftentimes extracting it to create concentrated cannabis products. And even from there within manufacturing, some manufacturers buy these concentrated cannabis materials and they convert them to yet another product. Tonight's webinar, we're not going to get into all the nuances of all this, but definitely what I want you to consider is that manufacturing has so many opportunities. There's so many different products, and we see new products entering the market every day. And this is really all coming from the manufacturing segment of the supply chain. When we think about from beginning to end, we're starting with cultivation. By the time we get to manufacturing, we're really sort of reaching the middle part of the supply chain where we need our manufacturers to create all of these products that consumers are demanding at the retail level. So manufacturing is really the link between cultivation and retail. They sit right there in the middle, creating all these products. Oftentimes, manufacturing operations are highly mechanized. So depending on the type of extraction that these companies are performing, they might have millions of dollars of equipment in there, but that's not the only type of manufacturing that happens. Just taking cannabis flower and grinding it up and making pre-rolls is a form of manufacturing because we're converting our original material and making something else with it. So really, in terms of the entire sort of opportunity that we have in cannabis, manufacturing, there's no edges to this. There's so many different ways you could think about manufacturing and having opportunities in that space to service other cannabis businesses, to create new products. And so it really takes a great inventive mind to think about, like, what could I do in the manufacturing sector? And there's lots of opportunities. Beyond that, for folks who are interested in transitioning their career into manufacturing, if you've already been working in another arena such as mechanics, you're going to have a great mind for this. And there's so many different ways to sort of plug into the manufacturing space. All right, so now that we kind of have a brief understanding of, like, what are these different segments, I really want to talk about partnership opportunities. Why do we want to talk about this? Well, we're all here together as a community to develop the social equity space within the cannabis movement in Los Angeles. And that is really going to be pushed forward through all of us working together and partnering together. The cannabis industry is only as strong as the community is. And I learned that immensely in all of my years in growing cannabis. If I wouldn't have had my community, I wouldn't have been as successful as I was, and I wouldn't have been able to share and grow as I did as a person through this movement. So when we're partnering with other licensed businesses, it means that we're looking at, hey, what am I currently doing in the cannabis supply chain? What are ways that my business is buoyed by working with other folks? And what are ways that I can support my community? And that really looks at how these different cannabis businesses work together. Yes, there's the licensed businesses, but again, we're also going to talk for a minute about all the other sort of ancillary or non-touch or non-plant touching businesses that can work together. So in partnership opportunities, we're looking at working with other cannabis businesses, leveraging ancillary support, meaning leveraging the help of businesses that aren't directly plant touching. And we can also talk about the ways that high THC cannabis and hemp can start working together. So let's dive into that a bit. So cultivation and manufacturing has always been a synergy since manufacturing even really started happening in the cannabis space. Believe it or not, I've been around so long in the cannabis sector that I remember when things like dabs and these really sort of rosin, all of these products actually hit the market. Before, there was really just cannabis flower. So cultivation and manufacturing have been working together for a long time because, again, manufacturers can't concentrate and make the cannabis products they need without the cultivators growing the cannabis biomass that they put through their machines and processes. So a lot of manufacturers are going to actually partner with cultivation operations and they may co-brand. And these type of opportunities are really successful, especially if a cultivation operation is already well known by the end consumer, meaning they already have a really wide base of people who love their cannabis flower. Those consumers would absolutely want to purchase a dab from the same from flower that was made from that cultivator, right? So that's where manufacturers and cultivators can really work together. Beyond that, you can still see the same sort of co-branding opportunity with retailers. Now, cannabis retailers have to get their goods from a distributor, but that doesn't mean that they still can't have partnerships and a great, camaraderie with the providers of their products, meaning the cultivators. They can have those cultivators come in and do pop-ups and provide education about their farming practices, about the products that they make, about the cultivars that they grow. And retailers can really benefit from this education delivered to their consumers because it makes it a personalized experience. And people love to hear more about the cannabis products that they're purchasing. So cultivation and retail and cultivation and manufacturing, they can all work together by supplying products to one another and co-branding. You also see this same opportunity within manufacturing and retail. A lot of retailers may consider actually purchasing concentrated cannabis products from a manufacturer and putting their own label on it. We'll discuss white labeling more here in just a minute, but manufacturers and retailers also can find a way to co-brand. Another great opportunity is a Type S license. So a Type S license allows a shared space for extractors and other types of manufacturers. And it's a really unique opportunity right now in Los Angeles. So let's say there's an extraction company that has leased a really huge space. Under certain circumstances, and you need to look into all the details and the rules and procedures around this to get a Type S license, all this information, PS, is available in your LMS. You can get a Type S license and be able to carve out a little piece of that manufacturer's facility to run your own extraction operation. And you'd probably greatly benefit from the fact that that extractor who has got the larger facility is already sourcing cannabis biomass, already making products. And there's ways that you can create a lot of synergy and greatly reduce your costs of operations. And the last, sort of concept of I want to look at on this slide is genetics. Hemp is cannabis and cannabis is hemp, meaning hemp is not this totally different plant, y'all. And this is a really common misconception in the cannabis sector. Even people who've been growing cannabis for a really long time think that hemp is a totally different plant. That's not true. So we need growers who actually create and craft new genetics within cannabis. And there's a way for growers to do that and supply both the hemp market and the high THC market. And so that's another great opportunity where if you're already working in the cultivation space, you could start creating cannabis genetics that are expressed with less than 0.3% THC and supply those products to the hemp sector. So that's something definitely to consider. All right, I just mentioned this concept, but this is a really, really, really great opportunity. White labeling. So what is white labeling? White labeling is when someone else manufactures a product and someone else puts their brand on it. And white labeling happens all the time. If you've ever been into Costco, that might make sense because Costco puts their brand on products, but someone else made them. And so there's a bunch of different sectors that do white labeling on a consistent basis. And we're really seeing an uptick of white labeling in cannabis right now. So I just mentioned some ways we could do this. Hey, I have a retail operation. I'm a dispensary. I love my customers and my customers love me. I think my customers might really enjoy buying a vape cart that's got my brand name on it. Well, I could go and work with a manufacturer, make sure that they're manufacturing a product that meets my standards, and I could work out a deal with them where they're putting my brand on those products. So white labeling is definitely a place where people can, jump in and get involved right away. You can also support the white labeling industry by not even producing cannabis products. You could source some of the, actual materials that we make vape carts out of, the actual carts themselves. You could print the labels. You could create the opportunities. You could create networking events. There's so many ways to get involved in white labeling. If I, were to sort of look 5-10 years down the road, I think that white labeling will greatly define branding in the cannabis space at the retail level. And so it's something you should consider. Another form of white labeling is called toll processing. And this is something that manufacturers do. Toll processing is when an extractor is actually making or extracting cannabis products for cultivators, for retailers. And this is a really needed function in the cannabis sector right now. So if you are really interested in starting a manufacturing operation, you could also consider just starting one where you're not even making your own branded products. You're just creating extracted cannabis goods that are going to have someone else's brand on it down the road. So let's now talk about companies that are non-plant touching or ancillary support services, because again, these are also great places to get involved. If we look at the entire arc of the cannabis story, the businesses that have thrived and been the most successful have been the ancillary businesses. And here's why. They're not subject to the same regulations, so they can actually weather the storm of how things are changing in the cannabis space constantly, as we all feel and know. And they can oftentimes remain profitable and adapt in a much quicker way. So what are ways to provide ancillary support services? Well, first, you could look at packaging. I just mentioned this. You could actually be the provider of all the vape carts that we put all our concentrated cannabis into. That is really needed right now. There's usually a lack of vape carts in the market. And so we would love to have a United States manufacturer of these. So think about something like that. Logistics is a major one, right? As cannabis operators, we're constantly dealing with logistics. And so there's so many different tools that can help smooth out the edges of how we run our businesses, such as QR code readers. So when you think about logistics, again, the sky's the limit. Find a difficult business concern in cannabis and find a solution for it. And you have a business right there. Another way you could get involved as an ancillary business is software. I have seen so many companies do so well in this sector. We're looking at how do we integrate with Metric, right? There's so many software providers that are helping cannabis operators work with the Metric track and trace system. And these companies have done really well. So there's a lot of different other opportunities. Think about there's new apps all the time, right? So software is a place where if you have an idea and you can build it, that is an awesome way to jump right into the cannabis supply chain and be supportive. I already mentioned these two at the beginning, but it's worth noting again. Tax preparation. We need certified public accountants that really understand cannabis. If you like numbers, I like numbers. Maybe you could consider getting a professional certification as a CPA and working and supporting the cannabis space in that format. And there's a bunch of other areas you could do this in as well. In terms of legal, there's a lot of lawyers that focus on cannabis, and there's also a lot of need for compliance experts. A lot of small to medium-sized cannabis businesses cannot afford to have an in-house compliance expert. And so those positions, like people who can actually provide those services, a la carte to these companies, is greatly in demand. Another place is trade associations. We need to organize and collectivize as a community. And so if you have a great idea or a subject that you really want to collectivize the cannabis space around, do that. Create a trade association. Put out content and newsletters. This is a fun part of supply chain to be involved in. Information dispersal. I love it, right? We're all here learning more tonight. And there's many ways that you can monetize and capitalize on that and serve your community. And the last one I want to note is inputs. Inputs is a general agricultural term for anything we put on our plants in order to grow them. So including, cattle, any part of agriculture. So inputs is, say, irrigation equipment, right? There's so many things that are needed to actually physically grow cannabis. And there's a ton of opportunities within that to create some new businesses and support those folks. Going back to hemp, and we kind of talked about this, there's so many ways that we could actually grow hemp plants and create a lot of different materials from it. Packaging is huge. Hemp can actually biodegrade over time, and there's ways that we could replace plastics with hemp. There are car manufacturers right now that are actually making a lot of panels on cars. For example, BMW does this out of hemp bioplastics. So if you really are interested in sustainability, I think that working in the hemp space would be really interesting to you. There's also great need for all the building materials like hempcrete that we can make out of industrial hemp. And again, we noted bioplastics, biofuels, the sky's the limit. There's so many things that we can do with hemp. And whew, we made it. So that was a really, really sort of brief overview of what are all these opportunities that we have in cannabis. And I hope that you all want to go into your LMS and learn more about all of them. And so now I'm excited to answer what questions you have. We can talk more about these different segments. You can throw any questions at me.
Thank you, Miss Natalie. That was very exciting and fascinating. There's just so much to talk about when it comes to ancillary that it's hard to know where to start on the elephant, because it's the everything else, right? We've been so hyper focused on the cannabis plant itself and the licensure and how to get into the cultivation of cannabis or a dispensary, and just the weight and heft and difficulty. And when you look back to other industries that have evolved over the years and where the profit margins are, where the folks are like, buying nice cars and actually enjoying a life outside of work, it's often the ancillary businesses, not the one that you're first in and last out from the day-to-day. So for someone who's just like, wow, what is this anyway? And I always hear this, oh, I want to start a dispensary. I immediately try to talk them out of it at first, of like, are you sure? Because it wasn't the folks in the gold rush mining for gold. Sure, there was a couple that got rich, but it was the folks that were supplying the picks and the axes, the people raising chickens and selling the eggs. It was the service industries that grew up. Look at Levi's, riveted jeans got popular around that. So what would you say just, to someone like me coming in and saying, well, I think I want to do all the hard stuff first?
Well, I would encourage them to consider an ancillary opportunity like you noted. And I think the best way to look at an ancillary opportunity is to first find what are the challenges in the cannabis space, which there's just so many, right? And there's so many ways that we could find solutions for them and really help operators. And I think that there's a lot of sexiness around having a cannabis business, and people really just want to start one, but they don't actually think about how difficult it is in terms of the regulations. And there's still ways to really be involved and feel like you're part of the community by being an ancillary support system. There's a lot of different, people who have been supporting the industry in the advocacy side for decades, right? And they're not actually growers or manufacturers, but they have been really working hard to make sure that we have a regulated cannabis system that provides equal access for cannabis for everybody, right? That's what we're all here to do. And so there's so many ways you can get involved, and it doesn't have to just look like you're getting a cannabis business license. And there's so many barriers to getting a cannabis business license. The costs are really high, not just necessarily the license itself. I just mean the steps that you have to go through, right, in order to actually get and receive that license and become operational. So if you really want to get involved in cannabis, I first think that you should absolutely go work in a licensed business. Understand what the day-to-day operations are of a licensed business, and then check yourself. Did you love it? Are you not scared yet? You really want to keep on going? Okay, great. And then think from there is, do I really want to start a new cannabis business, especially one where there's so much competition already, like you said, on a retail level? Or do I want to actually support all these companies? Do I have this great idea of a software system that could help solve some big issue in cannabis right now, especially in the supply chain side? That would be an amazing place to start. And you could go start that company, develop it, bring it to market, and not to go through some, all of these other sort of hoops that you have to get a license.
So these next couple of questions, in realizing that tonight's topic is ancillary, but how ancillary interacts with these licensed businesses, I think there's some interesting angles you might be able to explore. David wants to know, more about the cloning businesses.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Okay, so let's make sure we all know what a clone is first. So when we grow cannabis plants, we have two options. We can either grow it from seed, which is how most of us traditionally think of a plant as growing from a seed, but cannabis plants can actually self-propagate, which means you can take a piece of a growing cannabis plant, stick it in some soil, and it will actually start growing a new plant. It's a little more complicated than that, but I'll keep it simple for tonight's purposes. Cloning operations present a great opportunity for a couple of reasons. First of all, you have two ways you can get rid of them, and people don't realize this a lot. Because we allow for home growing in California, which is vital and important, retailers can actually sell cannabis plants or cannabis clones to home growers. The other, of course, side is the sort of large scale cannabis cultivators. They need to buy tons and tons of clones if they're not actually making them in-house. Now, a lot of growers are going to look at the costs of them producing all the plants that they need to, have their system, their flow work. If they're indoor, they might have multiple harvests per year, and they're going to decide it's too much effort, it's too much money, they don't have the space. In Los Angeles, space, there's not a lot of, wide open fields in order to do this, right? So there's a really big opportunity actually in creating cannabis plants for both commercial cultivators and for home growers. And it's also a separate license, a nursery license. It still does require you to meet all the same requirements of cannabis cultivators. So even if you're not growing these plants to maturity, harvesting them and selling them, you still have a lot of things that you need to do. But there's less people directly operating just in the nursery space. And so I think that was a great question to bring up, because I think there's really big opportunity in this. Beyond that, if we're looking again at the crystal ball, like where is the cannabis space going to be at in 5 to 10 years? Cultivars, so cannabis genetics. Most people use the wrong word for cannabis. They use the word strain. The correct word is cultivar. Cultivars are going to define the market. And so when you have a cannabis nursery or you're propagating cannabis, you really are sort of the beginning of that, part of the supply chain. You can help define what are the new in-hot genetics. You can try to source them. You can grow them. You can propagate them. You can create them. There's a lot of different things you can do in there. Now, propagating or creating new cannabis cultivars is not for newbies, right? You really need to have some years under your belt of actually growing cannabis and understanding how it grows in order to get into that space. But I think that there's really, really huge opportunities in that. So it's a great question.
Yeah, indeed. And the questions are starting to pop. So that we've got a few to get to now. So this is also kind of straddling both issues. Thomas is asking, is it possible to get a license to grow and sell your own cannabis? Or are all the massive corporations just white labeling their products? And I think there's an interesting answer in there. Go ahead, Natalie.
Can you ask it one more time? Sorry, I didn't quite.
Sure, no problem.
I
think Thomas is just concerned about still being able to get in there as a small business, because the large corporations, are they just all white labeling all their products? He really wants to know if there's still an opportunity for him to get a license to grow and sell your own cannabis, or are these massive corporations just white labeling their products? And take it away.
I get it. No, thank you. Sometimes you just need to hear it again. Okay. Yes, we all collectively share a huge concern around the influx of corporate cannabis or really large scale cannabis operations. As a cultivator myself, I can tell you that they really don't do cultivation very well, in the sense that if you have a highly educated cannabis consumer, they're probably going to have a lot of preferences for how their cannabis was grown, what it looks like, what the particular cultivar is, so many different aspects of it. And their needs are not going to be met by this large scale, highly mechanized, cannabis farming that we're seeing in the sort of corporate sector. Okay. So if you produce cannabis at a huge scale, it's actually really hard to produce high quality cannabis. And yes, this is actually true for all agricultural commodities, right? Another industry to look at that, I'm very passionate about as well is the wine industry. So in the wine industry, we actually have a lot of small producers that comprise, the whole sort of commodity system, right? We don't just have like a couple big wine producers. We have thousands and thousands in California alone. I think this system will also transpose to cannabis. Meaning, I think that in cannabis cultivation, if there are people out there who have a passion and a craft for growing cannabis, I think that they will have a place, right, in the market. Even if there are these people producing tons and tons of cannabis, it won't be quality or craft cannabis. And, you know, something to sort of look forward to. So even outside of wine, in the beer sector, a few years ago, so small craft beer actually became more than 50% of all the beer purchased in the US. And that took a long time, right, to replace just like the Budweisers and Millers of the world. But now we know that consumers actually prefer to drink more microbrewed beer than the big players. And we can do that in cannabis too.
And innovation really lives in small business. And so the big players like to look for that innovation. And then it's an opportunity for you to maybe become a serial entrepreneur or other exit strategies, or hold on to it and become that player of choice. So switching gears, you spoke about getting into software, and Ed would like to know, as a developer, or how do you see the opportunities as a developer, or can you define what software opportunities you see?
No, that makes sense. Okay, so obviously there's a lot of different opportunities. And what I'm really talking about is find a problem, find an issue that cannabis businesses are facing right now, and try to find a software solution for that. So let's look at an example of one that already exists, right? When we retail cannabis, we have to report the sale of all of these cannabis goods to the state track and trace system metric. Now, if you're a busy retailer, that is going to be hundreds and hundreds of entries a day. So there were software companies that developed really unique, specialized point of sale systems, then that figured out how to interact with metric, the state's track and trace system, to be able to sort of automate this process for retailers. This literally makes retailing possible. Like these types of softwares make it even possible. Otherwise, people would be spending hours and hours and hours and hours and hours a day sending this data in. And so that was innovative, and software was a solution. So the opportunities really lie where you can see issues that you can develop something to help fix it, like a computer-based solution, a software-based solution. I can't give you some great opportunities right now. You know, that's sort of your job. You got to kind of get in there and think about, from the development side, where do I know I could make a change or a solution, and then go out and develop that software. But I can say that it's a really great opportunity, and there are still so many business issues without great solutions. So it's something you should consider. And great question.
Yeah, these days there is a chip in everything, and somebody needs to figure out how to fix it other than banging it, turning it off and on, replacing the battery. As someone who has someone in the house to help program, it is important, and we need to hire people like you for that. So this next question, I'm going to navigate carefully, and I want to acknowledge Beauty, because you've been very active and we appreciate you being here. And the strict difference between quote unquote cannabis and hemp, just to briefly explain, because it is the same plant operating under two different regulatory regimes.
Yes.
And so we just want to be clear that currently DCR does not regulate the plant known as hemp under the Farm Bill. And so the regulations that DCR regulates has to do with the quote unquote drug variety of cannabis, otherwise known as high THC. So although the high THC can also be extremely low THC with a high CBD. So it's a regulatory funhouse. And, you know, stay tuned, because DCR is always updating regulations, and it's an opportunity for you to get involved, show up at other meetings and have those conversations, because it is an ever evolving issue for all sorts of localities and federally. And so, Beauty, I'm going to go to your second question, which is to explain the nursery regulations, please. And I realize that that's also a slightly different class, and you might be able to point her towards some other education that is or is about to be available.
Oh, that's great. So we get into a lot more detail about the licensing process in the webinar, in the series based on this webinar in your LMS. So I highly encourage you to look at that. When it comes to the nursery license, basically a nursery license is usually an endorsement on a cultivation license. So you're going to go and get a license as any other cannabis farmer would to say, have an indoor grow operation. You're going to get an enhancement on that license that allows you to propagate cannabis plants and sell those plants to other cannabis growers as well as to retailers. Now, again, distributors are going to be in the middle of this most of the time, but it's really not its own sort of special license. It's an enhancement to a cultivation license, but not everybody gets them. And again, there's really is a lot of opportunity in the nursery space. It also requires less physical space. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's pretty amazing how large cannabis plants can grow. But when you only got to grow them to be like this big to sell them to other people to let them grow huge, that's space saving right there. So, you can also have a successful nursery operation using a much smaller physical space than an actual cultivation operation where you're going through flower, harvesting them and, selling your biomass. All great questions. And then I also want to point out when it comes to hemp, we're going to see departments of agriculture. So the California State Department of Agriculture is who's going to be providing guidance for all of you on hemp moving forward. And LA, of course, will have their own positions on this. But what's cool about what the federal government did in terms of creating hemp is that we actually created a pathway to look at how all other agriculture works, right? Like hemp is being regulated like how we grow potatoes. So we're looking at a whole different way of how regulations work. And if it feels confusing right now, that's fair. It's confusing for everybody because we took a plant and artificially created a different type of it. It's not based in reality or science. And so it takes a little while to get used to the terminology and understand what you can and can't do with it.
Yeah, it is entirely fair to be confused. And
Yes.
if you're not, then you just haven't been paying attention. Yeah. So Ed, and this is your favorite subject, so we'll try to get to a couple more questions after this. Sustainability. If you can expound on sustainability, and I think like specifically as an alternative, business, because I think that sustainability as a business is there's so many different directions you can take with that for hemp or cannabis. What areas do you find promising?
Oh my God, love this question. Okay, so let's make sure that, sustainability means different things to everybody. So we can look at the actual environmental sustainability of us growing cannabis. We can look at the sustainability of our businesses, meaning how is our business impacting our community? What is the capacity of our business to survive and thrive? Generally, I like to look at sustainability as this concept where are our practices and how we're running our business, growing cannabis, across the board, consuming things. How is our pathway allowing for future generations to have the same access to resources that we do? It's kind of like a general way to look at sustainability. So if we look at it that way, that means that we can't just consume and not give back. The cannabis space is interesting because I think a lot of people already have this attachment to cannabis and it is a highly sustainable product, right? We think of it as plant, which means it has to be, just grown in the sun and, with very little sort of fertilizer and inputs. And that's just simply not true. So as regulations change, we're actually seeing a shift in the methodology of how we grow cannabis towards more sustainable practices because we have to. We're testing cannabis for these constituents that are harmful, such as heavy metals, such as pesticide residues, molds, toxins, right? And a lot of people need to understand how to do this, how to actually grow cannabis in a way that's compliant. So opportunity right there. First one I'll note here, Dale. If you have a strong understanding of how to grow just plants in general, it doesn't have to be cannabis in a sustainable fashion, one that minimizes the amount of toxins that you put on their fertilizer. There's so many different things you have to look at and how you're going to grow sustainable cannabis. That's a great opportunity. People need that information and they need that help, especially legacy operators, which are folks like me who used to operate in the cannabis space before we had these adult use systems, right? And our track and trace system. So if you want to, be a sustainability expert in cannabis, first of all, get really serious about what it is that you do, because sustainability again is a really broad term. And so some people might just be turned off right away because they're like, well, that doesn't really mean anything. So in my bio, Dale mentioned that I really focus on closed loop design, which means in closed loop, I'm sourcing, all the things that I'm putting on my plants from right around me. So I would grow companion plants I would, be harvesting manure from animals right, next to my farm and actually using that to fertilize my plants. That's just one concept. There's so many other ways we can look at this. But again, if you feel like you're an expert in this space, people need you right now in cannabis in order to make sure they're growing compliant cannabis. Beyond that, like also we have to look at sustainability of being a business operator. So there are ways that we could design our buildings and our, and the way that our customers move through, say, a retail location that is focusing on sustainable practices. Remember that hemp concept we just talked about? There, while it's really hard to get access to building materials made out of hemp, how amazing would it be of a message to your consumers at your retail location if you're actually trying to incorporate hemp bioplastics into how you design your whole retail facility? You can also look at the sustainability of the industry in the long run. Again, like starting a trade association, informing people about ways that the whole industry can rise up together, can look at, the future and think about how cannabis can actually change our mindset and how things are grown and how we consume them. We want cannabis to sort of uplift our community. And that means that we have to look at the ways that we grow it, the ways that we sell it. Packaging is a huge area where we need a lot of innovation because of the way that we have to sort of use exit packaging. It's what it's called. When you purchase your item from the retail dispensary, it's got a lot of stuff around it. And we need that, right? We've got to protect children. But there's ways that we could design or redesign our exit packaging, especially the materials we use to make it more sustainable. We could do, especially with me, a 5-hour webinar on sustainability alone. So I'm going to stop myself, but hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, that it's probably one of the most exciting things about cannabis and hemp. And I'll just add on to remediation that because of the way farming practices have been done, it's actually hard to grow cannabis on that same land. And so we need remediation specialists, and conveniently hemp is one of the best remediation. So there's so many different levels along the supply chain. And you said it at the top, find a problem to solve. That there are so many problems to solve in the cannabis industry, and finding those problems to solve is your next career, potentially your next business, potentially the next huge business.
Yes.
I'll also just remind us that some of the largest businesses today started in some of the most difficult times. It's because they're responding to some really big needs. Yeah. So it's endless. Beauty would like you to talk briefly about the regulations for drying and curing. And is there a there for ancillaries as well?
What's fun about that question, Beauty, is that the very first topic I ever consulted on a long time ago was drying and curing. So I'll go to the first part of your question. Are there regulations around drying and curing? Well, there are, in the sense that we are actually having to test the cannabis flower that's being turned into other products or that people are buying and consuming. How you dry and cure cannabis will influence your ability to pass these tests. If you do not properly dry out cannabis, then it can be a breeding ground for mold. And then you'll fail these tests and your cannabis products can't be sold in the market. Now, are there like a bunch of very specific regulations on how you dry and cure cannabis? No, but there are best practices in the cannabis space. And those are still being defined. And there is actually a need for people to really help companies, cultivators, understand how to dry and cure properly. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to a farm and been like, wow, these plants are beautiful. And then they sort of drop it on the end game, which is you're harvesting it. And you really got to, you have to design sort of highly technical spaces to dry and cure really well. And so, yes, there's absolutely opportunity to work in that space. But it's not necessarily highly specific to rules and procedures of LA or the state of California. Great question.
Yeah, indeed. And it is true. You spend an awful lot of time and money to get to the very end. You don't want to blow it. And so if you're really good at that, folks need consultants, and you know who they are by tasting their cannabis. And if it tastes like wet grass, then you're the consultant for them, right? Chlorophyll should not be there. Curing. So Thomas, thank you for asking about the career fair. Curious if it's only for jobs in LA or if there are possibilities for other online collaborations. I do want to share with you that First and foremost, the DCR is looking to make sure that they're bringing meaningful connections and employment opportunities specifically for the individuals that have been disadvantaged and affected negatively by the drug war. There's also a drive to make sure that we are bringing and connecting employment opportunities, not just for social equity participants, but also for transitional workers. And there is a section in the ordinance about good faith hiring requirements that also involve local hires. And so if you're able to get a kick butt job working on your computer from home, you just satisfied several of those boxes, I would say. So I think that interactive opportunities are also uplifted by DCR, in addition to the live job fair that is planned for March 19th. The day before, for job seekers on the 18th, there will be support services to help you get that job. And that launches a lot of additional services that are going to happen online. So we're also doing online career connections and additional peer-to-peer coaching, ways to connect interactively through the computer like we are tonight. So you don't necessarily have to physically show up, but we really want you to on March 19th. So there are 2 different RSVPs. And when you click, you can also sign up at the same time if you want some of that one-on-one coaching or peer-to-peer interaction. So make sure that you check those links out because that's how we make that happen. So we've got about 3 minutes left, Natalie, and I'm going to give you just a moment if there was anything else that you really wanted to close with, to recommend that is on your mind that I did not get a chance to ask you before we go into the closing.
Thank you for that. Well, I think, I just want to close with encouraging everybody to think about what we presented tonight. Sometimes in the cannabis space, and I feel this too, right? I've been in cannabis for almost 2 decades, and sometimes it can feel overwhelming. Right? We have these different ways we can go. We have these regulations. We already have all this pressure and, in terms of competition. And I want to remind everybody that, there is still so much innovation left, and we need new spirits in the cannabis space in order to kind of push us along, right? And so don't be closed off to like any new idea that you might have. And it's going to take really, although understanding the whole cannabis supply chain. Right? Like what we talked about tonight was really sort of cannabis generalism. What do I mean by that? We talked about so many different parts of cannabis, and we just briefly touched on it. But there's so much you can learn about each segment of the chain. And as you learn more, you might have a brilliant idea. And beyond that, just start off by working in a licensed cannabis business, because it's really hard to wrap your mind around what are the opportunities in this space until you kind of get in the nitty gritty and you start working in it. So before you just sort of shut down, like, man, I don't know what to do in cannabis, really just stop, educate yourself, and just go start working in a licensed business if you haven't already done so. And I think it'll spark a lot of joy, and I think it'll really help you think of new ideas and ways to get involved.
Well, that is one fantastic hit of hope, Miss Natalie Darvis. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. And thank you to our participants. Thank you so much for attending this webinar this evening. The full course for this topic is already available for you in the LMS for you to get more detailed information on tonight's subject matter. Also, you have a lot of templates that are available for you to use in your business in the LMS. These webinars are happening every Tuesday and Thursday evening. This Thursday, we have another webinar from 6 to 7 p.m. and the topic will be technology resource lists on cybersecurity readiness. I cannot impress upon you enough in our current time, you must be cyber ready, especially, I'm not even joking, this week. We are being cyber attacked by Russia. So please be on your toes about clicking links and join Brad Rowe and Dr. Delara Uskup from the LA Metropolitan Services. Very important. Next week, we would also love to have you join DCR for a webinar on transitional, local, and equity worker education and certification on Tuesday, February 22nd from 6 to 7 p.m. And for more personalized support, answers to your questions, we continue to offer free virtual cannabis business advice on the DCR licensing process, as well as support in filling out a commercial cannabis license application on a one-on-one basis. These sessions are on Zoom most Wednesdays and Fridays from 12 to 2 through March 2nd. So make sure you sign up right away. The next session is on February 23rd. So save the link that will be posted in the chat and we'll see you there. And before you leave, this is also really important. Please fill out this survey to share your experience tonight. As we are dropping this link in the chat now, we would greatly appreciate your feedback. We do use your feedback to fine tune these webinars and how we present this information moving forward. So tell us what you want. The DCR encourages licensed cannabis businesses to hire local, transitional, and equity workers. And to support these efforts, DCR will be hosting an in-person career fair on March 19th, 2022 at the Los Angeles Trade Technical College, otherwise known as LATTC. If your business is hiring and you wish to attend to meet and interview job seekers, or if you are a job seeker, we will also be providing small group and individual coaching sessions for both employers wishing to learn more about successful hiring and retention practices, as well as how to fulfill the good faith hiring requirements. So make sure you save that date, RSVP. And if you're a job seeker, there's also additional coaching for you on things like resume building and good interview skills. So please sign up for that live Grow 2022 career fair. If you are a social equity licensee, you can also sign up to receive that small business coaching. So don't forget, different links for employers and job seekers. Also, you can learn more about those good faith hiring requirements if you are an employer. If you don't know what that is, make sure you sign up for the coaching. Please fill out the form in the chat to let us know how you felt about tonight's information and presentation. And on behalf of the Department of Cannabis Regulation, thank you so much for attending. I am Dale Sky Jones of Oaksterdam University, and I do look forward to seeing you again real soon. Have a great night. Thank you.